So it was pretty amazing, actually. And we were sort of cock-a-hoop, actually, when we left Chinese airspace and flew across Taiwan. And then we were brought up abruptly in our mood by the fact that Andy Elson, who'd been flying his balloon, had just crashed into the sea south of Japan, and they'd flown into some bad weather. They were rescued, and that was fine, so that was okay. But we were only 24 hours behind them and headed for exactly the same sort of weather conditions. We clearly wanted to avoid those storms, and so we dropped the balloon down to quite low level and started working our way a bit further south. We kind of didn't realize at the time, and it was only when the Americans mentioned it on the radio much later on, that where we were in the Pacific, there was no chance of rescue if the balloon went down. There were no ships in that area. It was too far south for airliners to be flying over us. And then things really started to go awry.
So, Brian, in 1999, you made aviation history by being the first team to circumnavigate the world in a hot air balloon. Welcome to Aerobility. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
So, the story about your balloon journey, as well as making aviation history, has a lot of challenges behind it. So today we're going to hear about the more human side of the story and challenges that will, I'm sure, resonate with many of our viewers and listeners today. But first of all, put it into context for me and tell me, who is Brian? Tell me about your childhood and life up to that point.
Okay, so childhood was a very happy one, except for school, well, secondary school that was. Sort of suffered, as a lot of people do, with bullying in secondary school, which kind of sort of wrecked the education a bit, because I took sort of 6 O-levels and failed 5 of them. So nobody was terribly happy with me, particularly myself. And then I think I decided that I ought to join the Air Force, because although I really hated going to school, I was quite an outside sort of person. You know, I was sort of Cubs and then Scouts and then Air Training Corps, and so I was involved in that. And with the Air Training Corps, the Air Cadets, as they call them these days, I'd managed to do a gliding course, and I think that was the first time that I felt an affinity for the air. So, you know, with scouting and stuff, I'd done a bit of rock climbing and caving and nothing, and I didn't like the water very much. And nothing really inspired me until I got in that glider for the first time and I was in the air, and I thought, wow, this is amazing. And so that was when I first had an affinity for the air, I'm sure. And then I decided, having failed miserably at school, that I ought to join the Air Force. But with 1 O-level, you're a little limited on what you might be able to do. So I actually joined, they offered me a job as a clerk. I thought, well, you know, that's okay. At least you're in the Air Force. So then I went into the Air Force at the age of 17. And then quite quickly learned that I really did want to fly, and that sitting in an office just wasn't my bag. And so the only way out of that, really, because I signed up for 12 years, the only way out of that was to actually get the qualifications we needed, which was a minimum of 5 O-levels to become aircrew. And so I went to night school and managed to get 6 over a period of a couple of years, and then applied for aircrew training. I think at that time, most pilots, well, A, was commissioned and I wasn't. So there was that element to it, but also most pilots were from university, had degrees and stuff, and went through Cranwell. So although I had a longing to become a pilot, I wasn't a pilot in the Air Force for that. And so they offered me a job as a loadmaster. So I joined the flying fleet and went into Hercules squadron and was a loadmaster. And then after 5 years on Hercules, I moved over to helicopters and became a helicopter crewman. One of the lovely things about the Air Force, I suppose, in those days was that the air crew were very close. And of course, on Hercules, there were 5 crew. And on long flights, which most of them were, on long flights, we would actually, if you had a decent skipper, we would actually swap seats. And so even though my responsibilities were in the back of the Hercules, I did spend a fair bit of time in the right-hand seat and did some flying when the skipper allowed, and sort of sat in the engineering seat and the navigator's seat, which was probably the most difficult seat of all, but anyway. And then I moved over to Puma helicopters, and I was based at Odium, just down the road, actually. And again, with helicopters, when it was just a pilot and crewman, then the crewman would take left-hand seat, and it always made sense for the crewman to be able to land a helicopter in an emergency. And so I did a reasonable amount of flying there. So that kind of, it didn't satisfy my lust to, constantly be in the front, but it went some way towards assuaging it. And then when I left the Air Force, I volunteered back for the Air Cadets and became a gliding instructor. And then I decided that I would get my flying license. And so I did my PPL on airplanes, and then I did a course for seaplanes. And then I found ballooning, really. Ballooning was quite special. It was quite by chance. At that time, a girlfriend, her boss was given a balloon flight at the Bristol Balloon Fiesta and didn't want it. And so she said, would I like to go on it? And I did. I flew in the Bristol Fiesta in 1985, I think. And it was just magical. It's something about ballooning. I don't know what it is, but it's so gentle and peaceful and relatively easy, actually, because to fly a balloon, you only need one good arm and a pair of eyes. So it's probably the easiest form of flying. But I just loved it, getting up early in the morning and sort of just before dawn very often, and just flying first thing in the day in a lovely calm morning is just gorgeous. So that developed really into a bit of a passion. I sort of couldn't leave it alone, and I'd started a business at that point, and I thought, well, this is a good idea. We'll buy a balloon and we'll put the business name on the side of the balloon, and that's exactly what we did. And after a while, I sort of got a little bit bored with the business and sold it and stuck with the ballooning.
Had you run a business before this, or was this the first
time? No, it was the
New
first time. Yeah, it was the first time. When I left the Air Force, I joined the pharmaceutical profession. I wasn't quite sure what to do. I just knew that when I came out of the Air Force, I wanted to come out because I'd been flying at that point for nearly 10 years. And whilst it was a good life, you kind of, at the age of 30, you think, do I really want to do this till I'm 55? The same job. So I decided that there was probably more to life. So I came out and went into the pharmaceutical side of ththings.
So how did you find being out of your comfort zone with that? Because it's something completely new. Did you at any point feel out of your comfort zone, or?
Not really. It was a challenge. And to be brutally honest, I would pick up the Telegraph on a Thursday and look through all the jobs available. And it seemed to me that there were quite a lot of jobs on the selling and marketing side. And pharmaceuticals appealed. I've no idea why. It just seemed slightly kind of higher status than selling confectionery or something else. And so I think I got into it quite easily, to be honest, because having had the experience of the RAF, it gives you a real discipline. And I think from a sales manager point of view, they want somebody who has self-discipline, who can get up in the morning without being sort of dragged out of bed and go off and trusted to go off to work, if you like. So I did that for 3 or 4 years, and then I got into the training side of that. And well, and then I found ballooning, and that was the way I wanted to go. So we set up a ballooning company with a couple of friends, and we had sponsored balloons from Mitsubishi and Royal Mail and a computer company. And we became, I was married at that point, and my wife and I just became gypsies, really, that we would take the balloon around to the various county shows, and we would live out of a van and a B&B, and the pay wasn't very good, but wow, it was a great life. And
so how did you get sponsorship? I mean, because you're having to persuade people to believe in your vision. So talk to me a little bit about how you went about that.
I suppose at that point, I'd had a business background. I'd been very used to public speaking from the pharmaceutical side of things, because part of my job was to give presentations to large groups of doctors. So that sort of gave me confidence, and in terms of, and then the business acumen, if you like, with the company. And I suppose when I approached companies, I sort of knew what they wanted from a marketing perspective. And maybe going back to when I was a clerk, I was very able to put it on paper and structure a presentation. So maybe the whole of my background sort of, came to a point there. And we didn't find it terribly difficult to find sponsorship, to be honest, in those days. And it was just a great life. And I think then from the ballooning, because I think if you really like something, then you tend to be quite good at it. If you're truly passionate about something, you're probably an expert. And so I went through the whole gamut, really, of from flying to commercial license, and then to instructor rating, and then to examiner. And then I became the chief flying instructor for the whole of the UK. So my responsibility was to train new instructors. And with that background, in 1997, the challenge to try to fly a balloon around the world had sort of taken shape. Not much had been done before that, because the flight around the world depended entirely on the ability to have a GPS. And in the 90s, in the earlier 90s, there was no such thing. So once GPS came along and you were able to look at a direction in a balloon that you were going, then it became feasible. Difficult, but feasible. And so, the likes of Richard Branson and Steve Fossett all decided that they would go for it. And I think the reason that they wanted to do it was that it was 1999. Everything else in flying had been done. Furthest, fastest, highest, extraordinary, Concorde, supersonic flight, all that kind of stuff. But there was one page in the history book which hadn't been filled, and that was the very first form of flight, which was the balloon. Hadn't even got around the world, and yet we'd have men on the moon. So, it was a challenge, and I think it was seen as a historical challenge from some of our wealthier colleagues, and which is why they wanted to do it, I think. With Breitling Orbiter, Bertrand Piccard, the guy I flew around the world with, had started the project, had got sponsorship from Breitling in 97, and a balloon had been built in Camerons in Bristol for him to fly around the world. And he went off with a Belgian guy called Wim Verstraeten, and they flew for 6 odd hours. And then they had a massive fuel leak on board and landed in the Mediterranean. And we have some great photographs of this balloon capsule just bobbing around in the Mediterranean Sea with Bertrand sitting on top in a survival suit. And he described that moment as a massive inoculation against stupidity, because they spent all this money and all these people to work so hard to get this project off the ground. And I think the failure was a Jubilee clip on a fuel line. So, but I also think that it frightened them a little bit having to go into the water, because they hadn't done an awful lot of training. And at that point, one of the chief engineer was a guy called Andy Elson, who subsequently became one of our competitors for around the world. And Andy had been one of my partners in the ballooning business a couple of years previous. And he asked me to join the project, the Around the World project, because of my background in the Air Force, which was, so I'd had survival training and that kind of stuff. So I joined the project, really, and on my kind of first day, I sort of walked into the office and said, okay, well, what do you want me to do? And they said, just oversee it, just have a look and tell us what you think. So I said, fine, okay, you can let me have the checklists and the procedures that, I'll have a look over them and see if I can make any suggestions. And they said, what checklists are those then? And so I thought, okay, so we've got a little bit of work to do here. So I kind of became very involved in the project. And when Orbiter 2 flew in 1998, I was one of the controllers in Geneva Airport. And I put a lot of effort and input into the project in terms of crew resource management and survival training, that kind of stuff.
Just talk to me a little bit about that crew resource management then, and why you think that's important for a project to succeed.
Yeah, the crew resource management, or CRM, I think only came about really probably in mid-80s, I suppose, when people started to think about how crews got on with each other and how they operated, basically. And I think in those days, the captain would always wear his hat when he left the flight deck and would always be referred to as sir and all the rest of it. And I think there were some poor decisions coming out from a hierarchy like that, where, the skipper was the be-all and end-all on the flight and nobody dared to say boo to him or her. And that certainly changed with CRM coming in. It's a study of how people get on with each other and how it affects the conduct of the flight.
One of the things I really like, actually, just at the back of this book, is a quote saying, "We took off as pilots, flew as friends, and landed as brothers." Do you think that contributed to the success of the mission?
Oh, there's no question. There's no doubt. I mean, Bertrand and I, we only really got to know each other. Well, I'd never met him until I joined the project for the beginning of Breitling Orbiter 2. And then, so we got to know each other quite well throughout that. And then when it was decided that I would fly with him, which was only 4 months before we actually did fly, because I took over from another pilot, Tony Brown, we spent a lot of time together, and we got to know each other quite well. And yeah, I think for the last couple of months, really, before the flight, we did all sorts of things together. I mean, we traveled together and did the odd press conference and worked, of course, on the capsule and the systems and that sort of stuff, and worked on our survival practices and how we would operate if there was an emergency, in terms of who might go first and where our stuff would be and all that kind of stuff. So we were good friends, I think, when we took off, although he says we took off as pilots, which is quite true. But I think one of the most important things were that we understood each other, and we understood that in order to do this flight, we had to be completely professional, and we couldn't allow our egos to dominate either one or the other. And we were very fortunate in that the friendship was quite natural. So we didn't really have to work at it too hard. And when we took off, I like to say that we'd left our egos in the car park, which is where they belonged. And that quote from Bertrand was the result of 3 weeks in the balloon capsule where not a single cross word passed between us. And it was an extraordinary relationship that we had in the balloon. Fortunately, I mean, we each had our crises, if you like, at different times, which was just as well. And we were able to support each other, not necessarily by talking to each other, but we got to the stage where, you know, a touch on the arm or even a look could actually change the mood. And what he said about landing as brothers was absolutely right.
So you sort of developed an awareness of each other. So if you're in a high stress, high pressure, challenging scenario, you are aware of whether that person is, you know, losing their situational awareness or under extreme pressure, and how you can perhaps take them out of that situation, or, you know, you can manage the workload accordingly.
Yes, I mean, when I said we had crises, I don't think the crises were quite that bad where one might have to take over control from each other. But no, we had a mutual respect for each other, which we had to have, because if you think about it, our days were split pretty much into thirds. So he would sleep, he would operate, I would sleep, and then I would operate. So for 2/3 of the time airborne, we weren't together. There was only one person who was, flying the balloon. And so you had to have complete faith that your partner wouldn't screw up, make a mistake, would make the right decisions. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to sleep. And we both did sleep quite well. So I think that sort of shows that we did have the utmost confidence in each other, which, as I said, led to that.
It's an incredible example of teamwork, actually, just hearing this story. Mm. What advice would you give then to anybody listening who is in a team situation, how to make the most of that, how to be the best team member they can, or even perhaps the best leader they can, but to work as efficiently as possible to get the best outcome for everybody?
I'm not sure about advice that one can give on that overall, except that you need respect. You have to respect, even if the job is different, you need to respect the job and the person that's doing it. If you're a leader, you have to be aware of any potential issues from the person and discuss those and thrash them out, really. But I think that in terms of teamwork, the way I relate it back to the balloon is that, I mean, it wasn't just the two pilots in the team. I mean, there were an enormous number. Well, there were more. And although that we were very professional, I like to think that we had no egos on board and we didn't argue, there were a team of people on the ground helping us. So we had 3 full-time air traffic controllers that had been loaned to us by the Swiss air traffic control system. We had 2 meteorologists, world-renowned, and we had 5 people in our communications center who would then do shifts. It was as if all of the team were pulling on a rope, if you like, and the rope was attached to the balloon, and everybody was pulling at the same time, in the same direction, and as hard as they possibly could. And that's the sort of analogy that I would make for teamwork, that everybody pulls together as hard as you can.
So talk to me about some of the challenges that you face as a team then, because it wasn't all plain sailing and there were some, pretty difficult scenarios that you faced, such as, losing comms over the Pacific. So tell me a bit about those and how you worked successfully through them.
We had several times when that were difficult during the flight, and lots of times that were great, of course. But I think the first difficulty was the Chinese problem that just a few months before we took off, the ICO balloon, Richard Branson on board, Steve Fossett and Per Lindstrand, had actually strayed into Chinese airspace without permission. They'd been ordered to land and didn't, and eventually disappeared from Chinese airspace, leaving them feeling a little red-faced, I think. So they refused permission for any other balloon to enter their airspace. Fortunately, Bertrand had actually been to China the year before and had met several people out there because he'd been negotiating permissions for Orbiter 2. And he was able to talk from a Swiss perspective, he was Swiss, of course, via the International Olympic Committee, and was able to kind of cajole the Chinese a little bit. And eventually we got permission to fly across China, but we had to stay south of the 26th parallel. So that was quite low down in China, and it was quite a narrow corridor. And so the whole focus of the flight for the first 10 days before we got to China was on getting to China in the right place where we could stay south. It might seem a little difficult, but when we took off, we actually went south because we were going around a depression, and we managed to get down across the Sahara. And so our aim was to stay south of the Himalayas, because coming down off the Himalayas, you would get the katabatic winds, which come down off the mountains. And we could use those winds to try to line ourselves up for entry into China. So that was our focus. The balloon was working really well at that point, and we went across northern India and Burma, and then or Myanmar, and then into China. And we were just 30 miles south of what we called the no-fly zone. And by some miracle, I'm not quite sure how we did it, but we kept a straight line. And when we left Chinese airspace, we were still 30 miles south of that no-fly zone. So it was pretty amazing, actually. And we were sort of cock-a-hoop, actually, when we left Chinese airspace and flew across Taiwan. And then we were brought up abruptly in our mood by the fact that Andy Elson, who'd been flying his balloon, had just crashed into the sea south of Japan, and they'd flown into some bad weather, which had torn the balloon, and down they went. They were rescued, and that was fine, so that was okay. But we were only 24 hours behind them and headed for exactly the same sort of weather conditions. And that was when one of our meteorologists, Luc Trulleman, Belgian, said, I think the balloon should go south in the Pacific because I think that in about 5 or 6 days' time, a jet stream wind will probably form south of Hawaii. And if we could get them into that, it would be great. And I know our team said, our flight director said, yeah, okay, Luke, let's have a look at the charts and we'll discuss it, and then we'll send our recommendations to the pilots. And Luke said, no, you don't understand. It's not on any charts. It's just that I feel that jet stream wind, that the way that the weather is shaping up, I feel that will be born. So when they came back to us and said, look, guys, we think you ought to fly south for a while in the Pacific. They didn't tell us it was based on a hunch from a Belgian meteorologist. But anyway, we did. We clearly wanted to avoid those storms. And so we dropped the balloon down to quite low level and started working our way a bit further south.
Did you have the fuel for that?
Not really. It was a concern, for sure. We kind of didn't realize at the time And it was only when the Americans mentioned it on the radio much later on that where we were in the Pacific, there was no chance of rescue if the balloon went down. There were no ships in that area. It was too far south for airliners to be flying over us. So anyway, there was that. And then about 2 days out in the Pacific, we lost our communications, as you mentioned, with our control center. And then things really started to go awry because we could see these storm clouds ahead of us on the horizon. And we thought this could be problematic. We were about 25,000 feet. We knew that storms in the Pacific during the winter rarely got above 30 to 34,000 feet. So we knew that we had to climb in order to avoid them. And the only way to climb in the balloon was to actually lose weight. So we threw out all sorts of things, food, clothes, batteries, everything we possibly could, went over the side. And we managed to climb up. When we did climb up, it got extremely cold. The heater stopped working. And to give you, I don't know what the temperature was inside the capsule, but our water, which was in litre bottles, all froze solid. So it was pretty cold, which is a little demoralizing, I have to say. And then at night, you couldn't see these clouds, of course. We had no lights, we had no weather radar or anything like that. So we just didn't know whether we were going to fly into them or not. So the only thing we could do was to make sure that we kept the balloon as high as we possibly could. And then for some crazy reason, I don't know, well, I know why now, but we lost 3 of our 6 burners. Our fuel system was divided into 2. We called it a right half and a left half, and we lost one complete system. And what had happened was that it was all icing up. The solenoid valves were icing up on the outside. And I remember Bertrand looking at me and he said, "You know, Brian, I have to say I'm a little afraid." And I said, "Bertrand, you have no idea how good that makes me feel because I'm really scared." I said a bit of an expletive there, but anyway, but it sort of summed it up and it broke the tension a little bit. But we were scared, for sure.